Okay, cool. Well, we're live. Episode 1 of the Lyceum podcast. Exciting. Tom, thanks for joining here.
My pleasure.
Let me just go through the plugs of who you are and your books and all that. Professor Emeritus at Antioch University. That's how you pronounce that, right? Antioch.
Yeah.
Yep. In New England, and you founded the master's degree program in conservation biology, which we need more of, I believe. And you're a trained terrestrial ecologist with an expertise in forest, but strong interest in Arctic, alpine, and desert ecosystems. Wow. And then, of course, you got your new book coming out, which we'll talk about. But you also have a TED Talk, and you have Granite, Fire, and Fog: The Natural Cultural History of Acadia, Forest Forensics, a field guide to reading the forested landscape, which I'm excited to read in particular, and then The Myth of Progress toward a Sustainable Future. We'll talk on topics about that. But let's talk about your new book, which is coming out soon, I believe. Do you want to spill some details on that?
Yeah, I think that will be out in April. It's going to be published by Timber Press. They're a publisher out in Oregon.
Yeah.
And the title's called New England's Roadside Ecology, Explore 30 of the region's unique natural areas. So what it is, it's an interpretive guide to our really cool ecosystems that are pretty easily accessible from roadside parking areas. So it takes you into old growth forests, dunes on the Cape, alpine ecosystems on Mount Washington, bog boardwalks in Maine and New Hampshire, and a bunch of other sites. And in each of those sites, I'm sort of interpreting the trail as you walk it. It's going to be a pretty richly photographed book, maybe 10 photos per site. So they'll point out really cool things that I'm seeing, and it'll give you an idea where you are in the trail. So that's the whole idea, is just to create this it's sort of a first of a kind interpretive hiker's guide to the natural history and ecology that people can see when they're hiking a trail.
Yeah, that's really unique. And my question would be like, how did you scout those areas?
Well, a lot of them I knew already. I mean, I'd say that maybe a quarter to a third of them I didn't know. And I had to go down and just drive to them and then walk them. And I just take notes when I was walking and photograph things that I thought were important photographs to get. So it was actually a very fun project to do.
Yeah. I mean, that's probably, when most people, when they're writing a book, they're just sitting down and writing. You were in myriad of locations in the forest, which is my kind of thing. So that's awesome. How did you get into wildlife conservation, ecology, and naturalism in general? When did that bloom?
Well, I think it started blooming really early in my life when I was 4 or 5.
Okay.
This is like a sort of thing that people don't usually talk about, but my mom had mental illness, and when I was at the age of 4, I was left at home alone with her, and it got scary at times. So I would take off across the street into the woodland that was across the street, and that sort of became my sanctuary. I mean, it was a double-edged sword. I mean, in a way, I didn't get the care I could have gotten from my mom, but at the same time, I know that she knew I was down there, and she probably felt I was safer down there than being in the house. And so she gave me that gift of being able to bond to this woodland that became my sanctuary. And then that led me to know that when I went on to school and college, that I was going to have to do something that was focused on the outdoors. So I enrolled in wildlife biology at University of New Hampshire, even though I didn't know what wildlife biology was all about. I knew it'd be outside.
Yeah.
But I think it was there that I really loved to learn. I mean, I was a good student in high school, but I really loved learning there. And we had all these outdoor field classes and dendrology and mammalogy and ornithology. And then I realized that I wanted to teach, and I thought the wildlife background would be maybe a little bit too limiting. So I then went on to study plant ecology in my graduate work out in Colorado. So that's sort of the story of how I got to where I am.
Well, that's a really easy thing to learn about, because I was in a similar, actually nowhere near similar, but I'm an only child, and video games was one outlet, but I really spent a lot of time, instead of most kids at home when they're playing with their siblings, I was outside. We had a lot of wood woodland biomes and all that around in the back of our house. And it wasn't like it was a little woods and then street. It was a lot of woods. So I would just walk around and spent a lot of time outside looking at different kinds of. I think at one point I wasn't 4 or 5. That's pretty early, so that makes sense why this is imprinted into your career and DNA now. But I was a little older than that. I would collect leaves, and I always wonder why there are so many different variety of leaves, and like why aren't there one species of tree and one leaf? And that woke me up to evolution, Darwinism, all that stuff. And I almost went to school for zoology at UMass Amherst. I ended up going for business at Becker, but that was almost my path there too. So that's really cool to hear that, because I kind of relate, not as much as you, since this is like your whole life. But yeah,
but I think it's like absolutely natural for kids to just be drawn to the natural world. It is. I mean, it's like,
yeah,
I wasn't thinking that would be, my saving grace or anything, but I think we're just drawn there. And I felt absolutely safe in those woods. I felt like that was really my home in a way. And it's interesting. I guess, I must have had some sort of an eye for stuff because I never got lost. I could go down there and wander really far. And I knew my way because I could identify the different types of forests I was in. I knew how they were laid out in a mental map of my mind. It's interesting. I even learned how to identify different types of trees just by their bark. I didn't know their names. And it was so cool when I went to the University of New Hampshire and started studying dendrology to find out, oh, those really shaggy bark trees are red maples, or those smooth bark trees are beech, or, and all of a sudden I had names connected to them. Is like eye-opening because I knew them, but I didn't know what they were called.
Yeah. That's one thing when I look at your talks and stuff, I am astounded how you can probably just go into even me, and I'm a naturalist and I love different kinds of species of trees, but I don't know that any are different. But you can walk into a woodland area and just say, okay, this is this, and that. And you probably have more of a sense of variety of species than a normal person. So that's probably a cool, an awesome thing to know on your end, just to have those facts. How many species of trees are in New England off the top of your head?
Oh, God. I don't know the actual number, but I'm guessing it's probably up around 150 to 200 would be my guess. I mean,
yeah. If you asked a guy off the street, they'd probably say like 10 is my point. Yeah.
I remember when I was at UNH, I thought I knew a lot about the outdoors, and I was taking ornithology. I don't think I even had ever seen a warbler as a kid. I was amazed. And I thought there was like one species of duck. It was like a mallard. And to see all these different ducks, it was like so eye-opening. So yeah, the people that aren't really, given a chance to learn about this stuff, it seems limiting. But once you get into it, it's like, wow, there are so many species out there. And actually, I was doing a course down at Oak Springs, Virginia last November, and I had 2 arborists from England taking that class. Actually, this class was for international people over the country that I was conducting. And what was so cool, they were talking to me about how they preserve these standing dead snags. They're arborists, which usually work on live trees, but their specialty is going out and finding these dead trees and making sure they stay standing, because studies in England have shown that in a rotting dead oak or chestnut tree or anything like that, there can be 20,000 different species of decomposing organisms. So 20,000 different organisms in one rotting tree. And it gives you an idea how incredibly diverse the whole ecosystem is, because underground, that's going to be way, way more than that. So
right. Yeah, that's wow. And that goes into a topic that I wanted to talk about, lignin. I don't know. I'm sure you know what lignin is.
Yeah.
I'm sure you know that it's the rigidity part of the, and correct anything I say, but the rigidity of the cell, it essentially makes the plant cell rigid so it can chase that sunlight. And I'm under the impression that at some point, I forget what period of time it was, millions of years ago, but plants evolved lignin, and then the decomposing organisms could not decompose said lignin. And so there were just piles and piles of dead trees that just never got decomposed, thus creating coal, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's more complex than that, but you're on the right track there. But I guess,
Right.
it would have been the Carboniferous forests of about 320 million years ago, where all of a sudden, lycopodiums, which we see today as like princess pines that are just a few inches tall on the forest floor, and horsetails and ferns
Yeah.
became basically trees.
Yes.
So the very first forests were composed of club mosses up to about 120 feet in height, 3 foot basal diameters. And then the sub canopy were ferns and horsetails. And yes, they were able to get that size because of cellulose and lignin. It wasn't just the lignin, it was the cellulose
Okay.
too.
Got it.
And yeah, those are very hard things to decompose, and the decomposers weren't ready for that yet. So, so much of those Carboniferous forests did end up creating coal beds, and but it would have been something to walk in those forests because not only were they having big species of club mosses, ferns, and horsetails, but that was a great radiation of insects, so that we're getting really big insects like cockroaches up to about 2 foot in length, dragonflies with
Yeah.
wingspan approaching 5 feet,
Yeah.
and amphibians. The top predator in those forests would have been basically 450-pound salamanders called labyrinthodonts. It's hard to
Okay.
imagine, but
Okay.
yeah.
Now, was that because the trees were giving oxygen, which increases the size of the insects and how big they can get?
Part of that, it was a higher oxygen level atmosphere back then.
Yeah.
Basically, that was getting up to around, I don't know, 23, 24%. It got down and stabilized around 21.
Right. Right. Okay.
But the other thing is that whenever one taxonomic group sort of takes on domination of global ecosystems, then there's all these different size niches that they can radiate into. It's like, wow, I don't just have to be, I mean, I'm not saying this is like a thinking sentient being, but it's like, wow, I don't have to just be small. I could be big and still survive and find my own niche. So whenever a group comes into control, they radiate out to large and small sizes. So there were small amphibians, but medium-sized, large size. There were small club mosses and ferns and horsetails, but big ones and medium-sized ones.
Yep.
Same with the insects. So it's the same thing when, conifers and reptiles came in to dominate, or eventually when flowering plants and mammals came in to dominate.
Yeah. You mentioned, okay, so you mentioned sentient, that word. You mentioned kind of consciousness. Trees aren't conscious, I guess we could say, unless we have more to find out on that realm. But I would almost regard them as one of the most successful organisms on Earth, if not the most. Would you agree with that?
It's hard to say. I mean, bacteria have been around for a long time, and there
True.
are way, way more
True.
bacteria. And ants do a pretty good job. I think
Yeah.
10% of all the animal biomass is ants. So I don't know if you could say most
Yeah.
successful or not, but trees are amazing. And you know, um, consciousness, who knows? I'm not going to
No.
answer. And
Right.
one thing about science is we can only test what we can perceive. And so that means there's a bunch of stuff that's happening that we are not ready to test yet because we don't have the mechanisms to. So there may be consciousness there. I don't know it, but I do know this, that every organism out there, including trees, have biological cognizance. And what
Yes.
that means is they can receive information from their environment and then respond correctly to it. You don't need to have a brain to do this. So, for example, there's this one tree that I know of in Pisgah State Park in New Hampshire that was bent over when another tree fell on it from the hurricane of 38. So this is an oak, a red oak. It grows up like this. It bends over like this, and its trunk goes out maybe 10 feet. And then the lowest branch took off to become the new trunk. That lowest branch trunk now is, almost 2 feet in diameter. And you look at this tree, the cantilevered with this 2 foot diameter trunk that's going up 90 feet. And you think, how can that tree stay standing? Why isn't it just tipping up? But when the tree got tipped, it, could register the pull of gravity, restructures tension and compression wood, restructures root systems, and it's just absolutely fine. So,
Yeah.
so these things are not just static; they're constantly taking in information and responding correctly to it. Because if you're an organism in the natural world and you're ignorant of what's going on around you in your environment, you're not going to last very long.
Right. I have. So it's funny you mentioned that exact example because, as I told you on our first call, I go to a place in Sutton, Mass, called Purgatory Chasm, and I was there the other day, and there's this tree that I passed deep in the forest on one of my trails, and I'm just going to show you. I was going to bring it up here. I wanted to know how this happened. You might not. You might need to see more, but this is. Let's see if I can get the focus in here.
Oh yeah. So that
There we
is
go.
that is a weight bent tree. So whenever trees bend like this,
Yeah.
they've been bent over by snow or ice loading or another tree sort of landing on them. If trees have a bend like this,
Yeah.
that means they were tipped by wind and straightened out. So that was a weight bent tree that bent over,
Yeah.
and where that elbow is, where it turns, the
Yeah.
original trunk was going out like this, and
Yeah.
the lowest branch took off and came up like that, and then that rest of that trunk got shaded, died, and fell off and rotted away.
So clearly, during history, could be thousands, millions, whatever. The DNA of trees found a way to correct that if it happened, but at some point, obviously, they would just die. So that's another example. Can you talk about mast years? That's another example of something that just blows my mind and probably goes more to the argument that like trees are more than we probably think they are.
Well, I mean, it definitely speaks to the fact that individual trees are communicating to coordinate this. So what a mast year is, we can look at red oaks. Red oaks had a mast year here in New England this year. So did white pine, actually. So all large seeded trees or conifers that have a lot of seeds in, concentrated in cones are species that mast. And what that is, it means that all the energy that could go into making seeds for a number of years in a row is not used for that purpose. It's stored as starch in the roots of the trees. And then it may be 3 years later, 4 years later, 5 years later, 6 years later, all the trees of that species in a region as large as New England will all at the same time coordinate that energy and then bear a huge amount of seeds. So if it's a mast year for red oaks in New England, you go into an oak woodland, it's like walking on marbles. There's acorns everywhere. So this is a strategy to thwart seed consumers. So in like red oak, the major consumer are acorn weevils. I've never seen one. They're a small insect that hangs out in the canopy of oak trees. And in July, females are going around looking for acorns. If they find one, they lay an egg in it. The larvae eats a bunch of the meat of the acorn, then eventually metamorphoses and comes out as an adult. And there'll be a little round hole in an acorn that's hit by the acorn weevil. So if all the oaks depress acorn production a number of years in a row, they really depress the weevil population and overwhelm them in the mast year. And this is such an amazing strategy for oaks. If you see a red oak in the canopy of our forest, you can be about 99% sure it was found in a mast year. So they come in these age-even cohorts. Now, what we know is that they've got to be communicating probably through aryl chemicals picked up in leaves to keep them all informed that, this year's the mast year. We're all in this together.
Right.
Yeah. So we know that there is tree communication in that way and other ways as well.
Talk about the study on tannin levels and how a forest across a highway realized that the other forest was going through something. I forget exactly specifically, but
so this was during our gypsy moth outbreaks in New England back in the early 1980s. We had a number of years with severe defoliations from gypsy moths that actually killed a lot of our oak trees at that
they're
time.
still here. Yeah.
They are still here, but we've never seen anything like that wide. That was across the whole region. Now it's very spotty in areas. But researchers at Penn State University thought, all right, we don't have gypsy moths, but let's see how quickly oaks can increase the tannins in their leaves, because tannins thwart herbivory of insects like caterpillars. So they set up an experiment. They had one experimental group of trees, and they had a control group of trees. And these two groups are across a highway system about a half mile apart. In each group, they took off one leaf at the start of the study, one leaf off of each tree, tested it, and the tannin levels in all those trees were pretty much the same. But then in the experimental group, they went up in the canopies and they ripped up the leaves of the oaks in little tiny pieces like they're being eaten by gypsy moth caterpillars. And each day they'd take a leaf off those trees, test it, and right away the tannin levels were going up. But being good researchers, they had their control trees.
Yeah.
Each
Yep.
day they'd take a leaf off of each of those, test it, and their tannin levels were going up at the same rate. So they realized that there was some communication happening here, alerting those trees to the threat. They figured out it must be an aerosol because they were separated by a highway system. And through further research, they pretty quickly pinned it down that in oak leaves, if they're chewed up, jasmonic acid is released. And if a neighboring tree picks that up through its leaves, it's instructed right away to start boosting tannin levels. So that was that study in 1981. That was actually the first study of communication between trees.
Okay, so you're saying it wasn't through the ground or anything; it was through the air that they were communicating, essentially.
That's
That
right.
is,
But we know now that it goes through the ground too via direct root grafting. If trees are growing 10 to 15 feet close to each other, they directly graft on, then information
yeah,
that way, as well as
yeah.
energy and nutrients. But also mycorrhizal fungi in a forest link all of the plants in the forest together into a unit, and information goes through that web. Matter of fact, people
Mycelium, right?
what's that?
Mycelium. Is that what that's called?
Through the mycelium of the mycorrhizal fungi, right?
Okay.
And so people are now calling that whole network the Wood Wide Web, which has been around for millions of years. That's linking everything together in a information flow free system.
So, in your opinion, is that one organism?
It's a whole ecosystem. They're all individual organisms.
Okay.
They are linked in these mutually beneficial interactions. And that's the key to the resiliency and stability of these ecosystems. It's something we really need to learn as a human community. Individualism doesn't work. If you're out in the wild, you won't make it. But if you're linked in these mutually beneficial relationships that are mutually supportive, it supports everything. It supports the community. It makes it thrive. It makes it, resilient and stable. It's interesting. When Darwin did his first two books, Origin of Species and Descent of Man, they were just thought to be these amazing things by the community that embraced them. And then he got into these sort of arcane studies of earthworms and barnacles and orchid pollination. And everyone was saying, what the heck are you doing? You did such brilliant work. What are you doing? Well, all those books were about the importance of these mutually beneficial interrelationships between species. But nobody got it because the social Darwinists of the time had already framed the conversation that survival of the fittest was about competition and dominance and power.
Right.
And that framed the whole worldview, and it's actually framed our Western view. It wasn't until the 1970s that ecologists started, a century later, rereading these works and all of a sudden saying, oh my God, Darwin was talking about mutually beneficial relationships in these works. And that is the key to why our ecosystems thrive and do what they do. There's this myriad of these mutually beneficial interrelationships supporting the whole system.
Yeah, it's a shame that people like Einstein and Darwin and they just only live a certain amount of time, so you can't really get to that. And that's probably why we were getting to that second phase of his work. Can you talk about? I'd love to hear if you have any on top of your mind, any co-evolved situations in nature that just astound you.
Well, the mycorrhizal fungi, that's one that was mind-boggling because we didn't know anything about this much more than about 20 years ago. We didn't know. Recent studies, I guess Suzanne Simard, who works out of British Columbia, is the person that's really led the charge in this. So one of the things her recent studies are showing is that the largest trees in the forest have the most mycorrhizal sort of connections to other plants in that forest. And she's calling these trees grandmother trees because they are supporting so many of the trees in other plants in the understory. So a lot of our understory trees wouldn't make it if they weren't linked to these larger trees that are shunning them energy to feed them. It's really a remarkable thing. And then these relationships go back and forth between trees. So her studies have shown that in a forest of like Douglas fir and paper birch, at certain times of year, energy is leaving from the paper birch and feeding the Douglas fir trees through the mycorrhizal fungi. And then at other times of year, the flow is reversed. Energy is coming out of the mycorrhizal fungi and feeding the paper birch. And
So there's three parties in that interaction.
there is three parties, but it's benefiting them all. And when I went and did my undergraduate work, I was taught that trees just compete.
Oh, okay.
This completely changes that. They're not just competing; they're in these other very beneficial interactions. So it's not one species; it's all these species that are integrated together in these mutually beneficial relationships. It's like, I think what a really functioning community of human beings would be like. We're all individuals, but we interrelate in ways that benefits us all and creates a more resilient, more stable community.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at when I was saying like trees are more successful than us technically because they found a way to actually work together to propel their existence. I mean, we can't work together yet, but
Right.
that's a whole other subject. Yeah.
Well, I don't think it's humans that are bad or problematic. It's our system. It's the socioeconomic system we've latched onto because, humans have been on the planet for 200,000 years. For more than 95% of that time, they lived in gathering, hunting clan groups where there was the strong communal relationship. They had to. They shared everything. And they also had intimate connections with the natural world. They saw, nature is Mother Earth that fed them and gave them everything they needed. So I don't think it's humans that are problematic in that regard. It's the type of socioeconomic system we've latched onto, which I think is self-destructive. And if it isn't changed, it will destroy itself.
The world around us, the statistics of what, and you know more than this than I do, but the statistics of what we've impacted through each industrial revolution with all the civilizations on Earth in terms of nature and deforestation and species loss. It's people say that is nature because we're doing it, but at the same time, like it's not really nature if it can be prevented with just intelligent and intellectual innovation and realization of like let's be symbiotic, right? But capitalism, and I'm a capitalist, but at the end of the day, like I think corporations and everybody should just kind of find a way to align each other with nature, or else we're gonna not be living a good life in the next like 50 years.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think we have to change our worldview. I think we got to go back to the one that humanity embraced for 95% of our time on this planet, which was incredible reverence for the natural world and incredible commitment to living communally in ways that was mutually beneficial and supportive.
Right.
We have moved away from that, and we've done it based on these I think false notions of ownership, control, power, whatever, and it's led to greed, and it's led to rugged individualism, and it's led to a lot of things that aren't making a better society. And it is, and it's, if we keep on this path, it will lead to our self-destruction of this socioeconomic system. Not humans. Humans will be around, but this current system we're living in will fail. It'll start to dismantle and fall apart. And the biggest thing that's going to do that is climate change. Last year, estimates of costs from climate change are about $100 billion. The Economist's Intelligent Unit, so the Economist magazine, this is a well-respected economic magazine out of England. Their intelligence unit has done a study this past year that said if we don't do anything about, curbing greenhouse gas emissions, that will probably rise to $8 trillion by 2050. That's an 80 times increase of the cost of climate change in just 30 years. And that will start to completely dismantle the economic system. Agricultural productivity will go down, access to fresh water will get harder and harder to find. And then infrastructure will be damaged at rates that we won't have the means to repair. And it'll just start unraveling the system.
Yeah,
So we've got to change.
I know. I think if we need to take a hard look at incentives, because at the end of the day, I mean, the moon landing, which was a huge, um, innovative feat from humankind, it's not because we wanted to go to the moon. It's because we wanted to beat Russia, and we wanted to, So, if we look at incentives and we try to eliminate the incentive of oil companies to not have climate change be looked at as a, real thing, get that out of the way, and then we incentivize governments to want to bring, innovative private entities into play. I will give you X to develop something to eat up carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Then we're on the right track. But until then, it's like it's not gonna work. We need to. I mean, there's a lot of statistics saying governments are making progress, but I don't know how they would be.
Well, I have a different take on that. I'm not expecting that we're going to see significant top-down change. It never really happens in complex systems. All large-scale change in complex systems bubbles up from the bottom. So if we look at all of our social change movements in this country, women's suffrage, which took a good 70 years.
Right.
The civil rights movement, which is still struggling today. Same-sex marriage, which took a shorter amount of time. But all these things came from the populace. There was none of this that came from the top down.
Right.
And my feeling is it's going to be the same with this. If we're going to change this story, it has to be citizens that are going to change it. And I think that means really embracing sort of developing resilient, vibrant communities, embracing small-scale local businesses, farms, things like that. And if enough people do that, the government will follow. But I think we, the citizens, have to. Actually, I shouldn't just say it's only going to happen like that. It has to happen on two tracks. But if citizens are making that movement, then government will make the movement too. But they won't do it on their own. We've got to do it.
Yeah. No, maybe it's both of our ideas combined into some.
It is.
Thing. Yeah. So yeah, let's good stuff on conservation. I think that's important. Let's talk about what we're doing to. It has a little bit of invasive species, a little conservation. Let's talk about what happens when we deforest tons of acres and plant palm oil trees. What happens to that ecosystem?
Well, you're just dramatically simplifying it. So the second law of thermodynamics, this is going to get a little bit away from it, but I'll come back. It states that we can't. Well, the first law of thermodynamics states we can't create or destroy energy. We can't. The amount of energy in the universe today is exactly what it was, 13.8 billion years ago when the Big Bang happened. But we can transform it. And that's what the second law is about. It states that yes, we can transform energy from one state to another. So I've got lights on in the house here. That's from electrical energy that was transformed from some sort of energy resource, whether it's hydro or I don't know what it is. But we get electrical energy being transformed, then it comes into my lights and it gets transformed to light energy. But the key is that whenever we make a transformation, some of that energy is lost from the system. And that's a big thing because any open system that takes in energy or bleeds off energy can be in one of three energetic states. If a system takes in more energy than it bleeds off, it grows. It's what's called an anti-entropic system. That's what we were as kids, as we grew up. Then when systems reach maturity, they become dynamic equilibrium systems, which means the amount of energy they take in on a regular basis is equal to the amount they release from, let's say if it's humans, metabolic functions. And then but it's the third state, which is this entropic state where systems are losing more energy than they take in. So imagine a tree falling over in a forest. Now, entropy is often said to, as a system loses energy, it moves from a state of order to disorder. But those are very subjective ideas. A much more objective way to measure entropy is it moves from a state of complexity to simplicity, or a state of concentration of energy and materials to a state of diffusion of energy materials. So imagine a tree falling in a forest, it uproots, it dies, decomposers move in. Its complex structure It's complex molecules that you mentioned of lignin, cellulose get broken down to very simple molecules of carbon dioxide, water, nitrogen gas, and they diffuse out into the air and down into simple inorganic molecules that go in the soil. And after a number of decades, the tree is gone. It's been completely simplified and diffused. So mentioning, the palm oil plantations, that's an entropic process. We've taken these incredibly complex ecosystems, removed them, and put in monocultures that are very simplified. And it may look nice and orderly with straight lines of trees. That's why I'm saying order is not a good measure of entity, because that is a really entropic system. It's been really, really simplified. And pretty much every environmental problem we're witnessing today is an entropic problem. You look at it, we're looking at ecosystems being simplified, or energy and materials being diffused. So yeah, I think that plantations are a terrible idea.
Yeah, and it's even worse. I mean, that's happening, I think, a lot in Borneo, if I'm not mistaken. But in South America, with the reverse of that, which is probably every acre is probably the most diverse acre you could ever find. They're just being wiped out. There was a recent fire that was terrible. Speak to that. What do we even have left to discover? I'm assuming we only know like 10% of what we can discover from these places.
Oh God. I mean, we're really in our infancy in understanding the complexity of these ecosystems. When I say 20,000 species just in a rotting, tree trunk, it's phenomenal. I know our soils are probably our most sort of least studied area of the biosphere. I think we know more about deep oceanic trench ecosystems than we do our soils. And there's still classes today, high school classes, where students in high schools are studying soils, and it's not uncommon for a high school student to identify an unknown species in the soil.
Wow.
So there's so much we don't know because we're still in our infancy of understanding these systems. They are so complex. There's so many species in them. So if we lose the ecosystems, then we lose all that knowledge and all that biodiversity and all of that function for the biosphere. Because again, this resiliency and stuff is made by ecosystems through time becoming more and more biologically diverse with more and more species that are creating more and more and more of these robust networks of mutually beneficial relationships. That's what's building up all the resiliency and stability.
Yeah. And we talked about it a little bit in our first call, but it's really the beauty of genes and mutations and understanding how certain things were naturally selected to do certain things and the diversity that was implanted from the niches they're in. I just think personally that genes and mutations are miraculous in themselves. I mean, I'd love to hear your philosophical take on this, but like, I don't understand exactly how life could be unless I'm missing something, placed in such a perfect scenario where all these mutations are happening, and it just so happens that life finds a way whatever niche they're in. I mean, I gave you the silly example of if we were to paint a whole forest, like neon purple or something, and then plop take some deer, take some mammals, and put those into that that biome, and they're only in that biome for thousands of years. I guarantee we will eventually get neon purple deer.
Yeah, no, I think you're probably right. I mean, it's a big complex thing to talk about. I don't know what I can say about it, but like our Earth here in this solar system is placed in this position of the solar system, and because of the makeup of the planet and everything, it's perfect for life to thrive. Is that accident, non-accident? I don't know, but I think we're in a big mystery. But the thing is that once life gets going, it's going to take off.
Yeah.
really something that's very hard to suppress. And it's going to take off. It's going to diversify, and certainly, yeah, mutations are part of that. These are chance events. Most of the time, they're probably not very helpful. But if
Sure.
one comes along that is, like, all of
Yeah.
a sudden you get a deer that for some reason has a mutation that allows its fur to be purple, then that deer is going to be predated a lot less than others, and it's going to survive, and it's going to be part of the breeding population that's going to create a new strain of deer that will replace the ancestral strain. We're still, again, in our infancy of how this all works, but we do know at least how natural selection is working in this regard. It's basically, if you've got the genes that allow you to survive better, you're going to have a greater chance to survive, and you're going to pass those genes on, and through time, they're going to build up in the population. It's why, we have a lot of tree pathogens that are hitting us now. I was out in the largest old growth stand near to me here in southern New Hampshire in Pisgah State Park with some friends just yesterday. I hadn't been in there in 4 years. It was shattering to go in there. It's about an 80-acre old growth forest composed of hemlock in the lower portion of the forest, and up higher on the hillside, hardwoods. But in the hemlock portion, woolly adelgids in there, and it's basically, the canopy is about only half full of needles. And it's only going to be another few years before those, basically 400-year-old hemlocks are going to die. And we don't have any other site around here like that. However, as sad as that is, I am confident in time that our hemlocks, our ash from emerald ash borer, all of our trees suffering pathogens will be okay. Because in a island context, a new ecological relationship like that can extinguish a species.
Right.
But in a continental context where you have so much more genetic variability, there's always going to be some individuals that have the genetic makeup to make them resistant, and they will become the reproducing part of the population. So I'm confident that all of our trees will come back. It's just going to take time. It'll take a long time, actually. I think we know that something happened in eastern hemlock about 5,000 years ago. All pollen of eastern hemlock throughout its range was gone. There's no pollen of eastern hemlock for 1,000 years to about 4,000 years ago, and then boom, it's back again. So something happened to the hemlock, probably a mutated species of fungus or something took it out, but it came back. And I'm confident that will happen with all of our trees because nature's really resilient. But it just takes more time than we're used to.
Yeah, I'm curious. Were there once more species of trees than there are today?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm not, I don't study sort of like that sort of range of scope of time. I would say that right now we are seeing declining number of species of trees, no doubt, worldwide, as we're seeing declining number of species, everything else.
Yeah.
And it could be that, prior to this latest round of glaciation, which, we've had these glacial episodes for about the last 2 million years or so. Each of those probably does impact and might reduce species. So it might be that, 10,000 years ago, yeah, there might have been way more species of trees. I don't know that for sure, but that's a possibility.
Yeah.
In any case, nature always bounces back. So, for example, whatever we do with our extinctions, in 10 million years or less, nature will be back to as species-rich a planet as before we came along. I mean, we know this because we've had 5 major extinction events that we know about in the last, hundreds of millions of years. The big one was the Permian extinction event at the end of the Permian period. That took out, I think, 90% of the species on this planet. Within 10 to 15 million years, the biotic diversity of species on the planet was back up and actually beyond where it was before the extinction event.
Yeah. So that's what I was trying to get at, because if we started with if we started with 10x species of trees and now we're at 1x compared to that, I feel like maybe the natural progression of natural selection and nature is to end up with only one. But then we look at diversity, and it seems like nature wants to be as diverse as possible.
Yeah, it's all being driven by coevolution, which is being driven by energy efficiency. Energy is limited, out there. And so if any organism can develop a new adaptation strategy behavior that makes it more energy efficient,
Yeah.
it is going to boost its population levels.
Yeah.
And so it gets selected for. And the way they do this is by becoming specialized. This is the way that things become more energy efficient. You specialize, which means your ecological niche or your functional role shrinks, which means through time, ecosystems can add more and more and more species, building up biodiversity. That's how it's happening. And that's just the natural way that these things work.
Like fireproof bark in the redwoods in California, where there's a lot of fires.
That's right. Yeah.
Very impressive. Random question, and I just think it's hilarious because I'm assuming the whole world is excited to hear this. If if the whole world does hear this, but why do I have to keep taking rocks out of my garden every year if I already took them out the year before?
Take out what? Rocks? Oh,
yeah.
Well, that's because you live in New England. If you didn't live in New England, you wouldn't have that problem.
Yeah,
But
I know you know the answer though.
I mean, that's because you live in a glaciated area of the United States. So all that rock, this is glacial till that was deposited, and when the glacier was melting out, a lot of stuff just fell out of the glaciers and melting and just landed on the ground. So glacial till is a mixture of rock, sand, clay, gravel, whatever, all mixed together. So if we were down and had soils like this down south where there aren't freeze and thaw cycles, a few plowings would turn up rocks, you'd take it out, and that would be it.
Yep.
But here in New England, when the ground freezes, it expands.
Sure.
And if there are, plants that have roots in the ground year-round, like forests or hay fields or lawns, those perennial roots stitch everything in the ground into a unit. So the whole thing expands, and then when it thaws in the spring, settles, and rocks stay in place. But if you have a site like a garden that has no perennial roots in it, when the ground freezes, the freeze is coming down. Let's say it latches onto a rock. The ground keeps freezing. That rock, as the ground is freezing, expanding, gets lifted up. And what people don't realize is the thaw, when it comes out of the ground, commences from the bottom up. Because once you get below the frost zone, our soil temperatures around here are around 55 degrees. There's an incredible heat reservoir down there. So the thaw zone is moving up.
Yep.
The rock is frozen in place while the pocket below it thaws and collapses a bit. And then when the rock is released, it can't get down to its original starting point. So each year the rocks are lifted up a little bit at a time, and eventually they come up to the surface and have to be picked out.
So they're not reproducing. Okay, good.
They're not reproducing. But no, it looks like they are, but they're not.
Okay. Another question is, I've of course grew up in New England, and I've very often been checking out different woods and forested areas, and I find random stone walls that I'm assuming marked property lines. Where did those come from, and why?
Some of them are marking property lines, but they weren't built to do that. So those stone walls were functional farm walls. So, this area was settled by the British, and, like if you go to, Britain, anywhere, you're going to find in agricultural areas stone walls crossing everywhere, because that's what they had to work with. So they were used to that. So those stone walls, originally stone walls weren't built. People originally, they're clearing the forest around here, were making, zigzag split rail fencing. It was much easier to do that. You could put up 10 times as much of fencing with wood a day as you could stone walls. But when we get agriculture in New England, deforesting about, 75, 80% of the landscape, there's no longer enough wood.
Right.
But then those wood fences, they rot, start getting replaced by stone fences. And those stone fences were built to keep livestock in pastures or out of crop fields and hay fields. And you can pretty much figure out, if you're out in the woods around here, what was going on agriculturally in those areas. If you have a rock wall that's only made of large stones, no small fist-sized stones, that means that wall was either bordering a hayfield or a pasture.
Okay.
And if you look at the ground, if the ground is smooth and even, not lumpy looking, that would say hayfield, because hayfields had to be plowed, and the pits and mounds that happened from live trees falling in a forest were plowed out and evened out. But if you go into a forest that's never been plowed, the ground's going to be lumpy from all these what are called pits and mounds or pillows and cradles. When a live tree falls over, its roots rip out of the ground, excavating a pit or a cradle. And then when the roots rot, all the excavated earth is deposited to make a mound or a pillow. So you get what's called pit and mound or pillow and cradle topography. And those features can be visible for, big ones up to 1,000 years after an event that took down a live tree. So if the stone fence is bordering an area that's lumpy, that was a pasture. If it's bordering an area that was smooth and even, that was a hayfield. But if the stone fence has a lot of small fist-sized rocks in it, and the ground is smooth and even, that was a crop field. So these walls were very functional, and you can interpret them looking at the type of rocks in them and the ground on either side.
Yeah. I have to say I've seen most, and there's one in front of my house. I've seen most that are just rocks like this big, probably, and flat.
Yeah.
So cool. That's definitely interesting. Last question, definitely a loaded one. But I'd love to hear your reaction, just because of your kind of library of knowledge in the topic. What would you say is probably the most important discovery we have yet to get out of forest ecology or trees, just in general, that would elevate our understanding about what's around us?
Wow, I have no idea. But, if you had asked me this question 25 years ago, that mycorrhizae would come up and all the stuff that's going on there, I would have just not even known. So I think that's why I say we're very much in our infancy here of understanding these systems. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of mind-blowing discoveries about what's going on, and I can't imagine what they are at this point. But I have a great faith in nature. Nature's figured this all out. I think that we just need to model how we behave with way nature behaves, and we'd be absolutely fine. Because the natural world's been around for 3.8 billion years. It's not only sustained itself, it's thrived for that time. That's a long time to try to comprehend. So to give people an analogy to try to imagine, I say, all right, think about the thickness of a standard sheet of paper, and think if that's going to represent 1 century.
Yeah.
The question becomes, how tall a stack, each sheet representing a century, would we need to represent 3.8 billion years? And the answer is we'd need a stack of paper way over 3 miles in height.
Yeah.
Can you imagine how many sheets that is? And more than a lot. It's like mind-boggling. And yet, during that time, nature has not only sustained itself, and it's thrived. And we just need to follow nature's guidance, and we would be absolutely fine, and we'd thrive.
Yeah. Well, it's a great sentence to end on. Tom Wessels, professor at Antioch University. Plug your upcoming book again one more time. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's just called, it's titled New England's Roadside Ecology, Explore 30 of the region's unique natural areas.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for hopping on for episode 1, and I appreciate it.
Yeah. Very good. Good luck to you.
Thank you.